Good morning. I invite you now to transition from our secular world of our lives to a sacred space and time with this morning's prelude, played by Gene Olson. It's entitled Before the Dawn by Michael Logazar. Gene? Thank you, Gene. Good morning and welcome to San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. Now, whether you're visiting us in the sanctuary or watching from home, we're here for you too, and we're glad you could join us today. My name's Woody Hibbard. My pronouns are he, his. And I've been a member of the San Gabriel UU for about 3 years, a little longer than that. Prior to that, I would have ticked the box none. That's N-O-N-E, none, affiliation. And I've been retired since 2005, and it's been great. And I also serve this year on your board of trustees. So I'm glad to be your lay leader this morning. San Gabriel is a member of the Unitarian Universalist Association. If you'd like to know more about us and learn more about the upcoming events, please go to our website or sign up for the newsletter. A lot of good stuff in that newsletter. It keeps you right up to date. And please know that whoever you are, wherever you're from, whomever you love, wherever you are on life's journey, whatever your gender identity or immigration status, you're welcome here. Okay, now this Sunday we have Reverend Lou Snead and Dr. Brian Bolton have been invited to engage in a conversation about their understanding of the shared and differing perspectives on religious and non-religious orientations toward life and the belief in God that exists in our culture today. This is going to be interesting stuff, folks. We're going to like this. So at the end of the conversation, there's going to be an opportunity for questions. So get those notepads out and get the questions ready, and let's challenge these gentlemen today. Okay, we'll begin by lighting our chalice. This chalice is a symbol of our shared identity as Unitarian Universalists. When we light this chalice, we're giving witness that we're a church with open minds, we're a church with loving hearts, and we're a church with helping hands. Our opening hymn today is number 354 in the gray hymnal. The words will be projected. Please stand if you're able, and let's sing together. And we will be singing 2 verses. Is that correct, Jean? 2 verses.
1 and 4.
Oh, 1 and 4? Okay, 1 and 4.
Thank you all. Welcome. We're glad that you're here today. We have a number of folks here who are visiting, I know, and we want to say a special welcome to a number of you. Some of them are actually friends of mine who come to really try to figure out what does this guy really believe or not. But we're glad that they're here. For our service today, as you heard from Woody, we've been invited to engage in a conversation. Me and my friend, Brian Bolton, sitting back here, and he'll be up here in a minute, about religious experiences, and particularly perspectives that use God language. To address this issue, we plan to really interview one another. We met and came up with a series of questions we hope will provide some insight. But after we kind of share some of our perspective with one another, then we're going to open it up to a Q&A and let you folks ask us, challenge us, stimulate us with your own thinking about what we've talked about. If we had to put a topic over top of this, we could have picked 100 different ways of framing this, but we framed it this way. Does God have a credibility problem in the world today? So some of you here may remember, if you're as old as at least I am, the nationwide heartburn that Madalyn Murray O'Hair created back in the 60s when she challenged the notion of Bible reading and prayer in public schools. And there was a firestorm of reaction because this was perceived to be a Christian nation. Then the popularity of atheism as a non-religious worldview really gained more notoriety at the beginning of the 21st century. Many of you may remember some of these best-selling books by people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hudgens. These were atheists who came out and kind of stated why they did not believe in some transcendent being, particularly if it sounded like what a lot of Christians had been promoting in traditional Christianity for years. And atheists often get lumped together just as Christians do. Just as I have as much heartburn being lumped with fundamentalist Christians, many atheists don't want to be lumped with everyone else. So you find, even among atheists, agnostics and humanists and free thinkers and skeptics and secularists and a whole bunch of other markers, all of which hold kind of a naturalistic worldview and place strong emphasis on reason, rationality, and science as the best means to understand the reality of the world and our lives in it. Now, UU congregations like ours often become a spiritual oasis, I believe, for those who have difficulty believing in supernatural beings as traditionally described by Orthodox Christianity in particular, but still who appreciate some of the moral values that have been embodied in a long tradition, at least in the UU tradition, out of liberal Christianity. While atheism is often seen as a threat to traditional religious views, there's been, I'm glad to say, a long-standing openness within the UU tradition and congregations to appreciate both the philosophical and the moral perspectives embraced by many self-identifying agnostics, skeptics, humanists, and atheists. Reverend Jamie sent this quote from a UU periodical that they believe captures where many of us in UU congregations are today spiritually. It says, this is a UU person, "I find it impossible to rule out the possibility of any sort of God. Yes, the world can be explained without God, but that doesn't prove the negation of the possibility or the lack of possibility that there is something more. The God I believe could be possible would be a God that, if God is a sentient being, cares for and loves all people equally and with perfect love, that ultimately saves everyone. More likely, God is something more like love or positive energy or the greater sum of all the parts of the universe or something that we create together in the work of love and justice. It's quite possible that humans do create God and that God isn't fully created yet. Those kinds of God are possible to me. I hope our conversation this morning that we're going to have will illuminate both some of the shared perspectives that many progressive Christians like me have with many atheists and friends like Brian, and maybe at the same time help clarify our differences about religious beliefs and practices. That's my hope, at least. We simply plan to interview each other and ask questions, kind of get at some of these spiritual orientations, and then we're going to invite you to join in that. In a nation that has now as many people identifying religiously as nuns, we hope our conversation will be informing and spiritually stimulating.
Our congregation has a shared affirmation that unites us in a common mission and purpose. And I invite you at this point to read after me. The words will be projected, our responsive affirmation. The doctrine of this church is love.
We are here to love.
The quest of truth is its sacrament.
We are here to learn.
Service is its prayer.
We are here to care for others.
To dwell together in peace.
We are here to live in peace.
To seek knowledge and freedom.
We are here to honor our differences.
To serve humanity in fellowship.
We are all connected in spirit.
To the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine.
We are here to grow.
Thus we do covenant with one another.
This we promise to do together.
And I believe now it is time for Karina and the Wonder Box.
Good morning, all. We've said good morning many times by now, haven't we? All right. We use, as Lou has shared with us already today, encourage a wondering mind, and we work together to expand our learning. And so this is a little part of that as we make a guess as to what might be in here based on what it sounds like. What do you think? Fairly noisy this morning. I would love some shout outs of what you think might be in here. I didn't hear. Dirt. Okay. Noisy dirt. A question mark? Oh, yeah, that would be fun. Any cards? Oh, gift cards? Or playing cards? Let's see if I can, if the lights were off in here, it'd be more impressive what's in here. Got a little bit of light. And today I wanted to share with you a story for this time of year called The Shortest Day, and it's actually a poem. So we'll hear this and then we'll chat for a minute after. So let's listen.
The Shortest Day by Susan Cooper, illustrated by Carson Ellis, published by Candlewick Press. So the shortest day came, and the year died. And everywhere down the centuries of the snow-white world came people singing, dancing to drive the dark away. They lighted candles in the winter trees. they hung their homes with evergreen. They burned beseeching fires all night long to keep the year alive. And when the New Year's sunshine blazed awake, they shouted, reveling. Through all the frosty ages, you can hear them echoing behind us. Listen. All the long echoes sing the same delight this shortest day, as promise wakens in the sleeping land. They carol, feast, give thanks, and dearly love their friends, and hope for peace. And so do we, here, now, this year, and every year. Welcome, Yule. The end.
And Susan Cooper, who wrote that as a poem, shares that from the very beginning, our lives have been cyclical. The rebirth rituals as seasons close have become traditions we still celebrate, whether or not we remember where they came from. It is a universal impulse, this celebration of light, as the symbol of continuing life. We see it in our own chalice. The Yule and evergreens of the poem come from Northern Europe, but the candles in those trees belong to the same family as the menorah candles of Hanukkah, which begins next week, or the oil lamps of Diwali. Christianity and many other faiths share their intention. They are the lights of hope and reach for the triumph of good over evil. This shortest day is for everyone. So that's what I love to bring to this holiday season, is how all these things come together at this particular time of year. I have some crafts in the back, if anyone would like to join me.
Thank you, Karina. There were a number of things listed here. If you would look at this, you should have received a handout. You can see the holiday worship schedules listed there. You can see new connection groups are being formed. There's information about that we call your attention to. There's, for readers, there are several opportunities listed. Contributions for the Caring Place. Ron told me today that we've already got a sizable number of collections from the Congregation for the Caring Place. That's the community faith-based group that provides non-perishable food goods for people in need. We have our own little free food pantry out here we're collecting food for. There's a box in the coffee room for that purpose. But the Caring Place this year, instead of filling a blue barrel, has asked us to make financial contributions, because what they have learned, aside from storage space issues, they can buy 6 times as much food per dollar as you and I can get at the grocery store, because they shop at the Central Texas Food Bank. So financial contributions really help them in multiple ways. So there's information about that listed here too. And finally, I wanted to alert everybody that our Social Justice Committee that I chair happens to be getting ready to have another meeting this coming Wednesday at 7 p.m. It's a virtual meeting. You don't have to drive anywhere. We can give you the link and you can participate. But we welcome more folks to join us as we try to think about developing programs for our congregation to engage folks in social justice issues and causes. So if you're interested in that, speak to me. You can speak to Michelle. We will make arrangements for you to participate in that. And I think it's now time for the Collect a Morning offering. Woody?
Well, each week we take an offering to sustain this space and community that we call our spiritual home, and to support the work in the world by this fellowship. As the ushers collect the offering, please know how grateful San Gabriel is to you for giving you your time, your talent, and your financial support. As a gift to us this season, our music director has provided a video to watch.
Light of our hearts are burning bright. We dream of the spring this winter's night. Surely the earth is turning from dark to light. Gathered friends in reverence here to celebrate the longest night. Light of our hearts are burning bright. We dream of the spring this winter's night. Light of our hearts are turning bright. We dream of the spring this winter's night. Light of our hearts are turning bright. We dream of the spring this winter's night. Gathered friends in reverence here is turning from dark to light. Gathered friends in reverence here we celebrate the longest night. Light of our hearts are burning bright. We dream of the spring this winter's night. Gathered friends is turning from dark to light. Gathered friends in reverence here to celebrate the longest night.
Okay, we would like to invite Dr. Bolton up front, and it's time for our presentation and discussion with Reverend Snead and Dr. Bolton. Get those questions ready.
Those of you who unfortunately know me and that you may not know much about me, so we decided to spend a lot of time and talk. So, I met Brian before the pandemic started. He and I had, thank you. He and I had shared a little bit of time for a year or two on a community forum that was created by one of the folks that used to go here, Wayne Dawson, where we were trying to come together across a big spectrum of viewpoints, from liberal to conservative, to talk about some of the controversial issues in the public square. And we were dealing with things like abortion, you just list of all the names of the things that you know still are in the public square that are contentious. We were dealing with that. I didn't know Brian at that point, and so we got in the room and we started discussing that and figuring out how we're going to structure those conversations at the public library and invite people to come to. Next thing I know, I find myself agreeing with Brian on almost everything. And so we developed a relationship from that, and we've kept that relationship going even after the community forums ended. So when the worship committee was thinking about how do you fill some of these Sundays when Reverend Jamie's not here or Karina's not doing the services, I was asked, and I called Brian and said, they want to see if we could have a conversation about the differences between Christians and atheists. And he said, sure. Brian has told me that he's done similar kinds of things at the Unitarian Universalist Church when he was in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and exile there. And during his teaching and research career, as you can see, he was a research psychologist, but he's also been a life member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, but he now lives here. But when he was gracious about being willing to do that, I told him, yeah, let's have these conversations. So Brian and I are just going to take a few minutes here, just kind of interview one another. To start with, Keith, if you have a slide there, it's really a 1930s Christian fundamentalist cartoon. It's in that slide bank. See if you can find that for us, because I think this speaks volumes of what's going on in what is considered the modern world with the development of science from the Enlightenment period, but particularly in the religious communities in this nation through the 1920s and 1930s. There was a clash between what was called modernism and Christian fundamentalism. My own background, growing up in a Southern Baptist church, I reached a point where, for me at least, somewhere around the 7th or 8th grade, I could no longer understand, appreciate, or even tolerate what I was hearing at church. So I pretty much dropped out. My cousin, who's a year older, he said, we don't need to go hear all that ear banging every Sunday. So I was out of church for a good part of my teen years until I got into college. So, I'm one of these atheist authors, I think Dawkins calls himself, a cultural Christian, meaning I just inherited, whatever faith I had simply by going to church. But Brian, we appreciate you being here. Thank you much. I think, these questions we hope will get in a small way at what we both understand as kind of our take on religion and religious orientations. So the first question is, what do you mean when you call yourself an atheist? Can you hear me? Is my mic on? Here, you just... Don't worry about it.
Here, I've got one here, Woody. Now can you hear me? Okay. First, I want to say I'm happy to be back with the Unitarians. It's been more than 20 years since I've addressed the groups in Fayetteville and Eureka Springs. Have you ever been to Eureka Springs? Quaint little town in northern Arkansas, and I think it was founded by Gerald L.K. Smith. Is that right? A racist. So I'm happy to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I want to give credit to Lou and Michelle for arranging the program. Lou was asked what it means to be an atheist, in my case. I think I'll address a little history as part of my answer, Lou. I have never been a believer. I have never believed in the gods, even though I attended a Presbyterian Sunday school from about age 4 to 14. In fact, I can see in my mind's eye the little South Ridge Presbyterian Church in Fairway, Kansas. From about age 4 to 8, I was a faithful attender. In fact, I received attendance pins for my good attendance. but I never accepted any of the propositions. I did not reject God intellectually. I just never had an interest. After age 8, I became increasingly resistant to attending Sunday school. By age 14, I absolutely refused. It's not because I objected to anything in the Presbyterian doctrine or Christian doctrine. It's because it just did not strike me as reasonable at that very young age. Now here's a brief definition of atheism. To define atheism, the negation of theism, it's necessary to define theism. Theism is the belief that gods exist, that they have existence. So the negation, atheism, is the absence of that belief. Now that is the passive definition, just not holding the belief. The more active or militant definition is the rejection of God. Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and others that Lou mentioned were more active or more militant atheists. If you have read the local newspaper over the last 15 years, you've seen some of my statements. I also reject the belief in gods, but I'm not a militant because I have so many good friends who do believe, and family members. So it's not an aggressive stance, it's the absence of belief in the gods. Lou, I'm going to ask you essentially the same question.
Well, as I thought about, I don't believe I'm a theist either. I learned way back early on, I went to graduate school in religion at Florida State, pretty much out of a spiritual journey. I was just asking these same kinds of questions. I had rejected a lot of that Southern Baptist mindset. I had no room for any of this thinking about the atonement of Jesus' death to save humanity. I didn't understand or appreciate all of this biblical literalism that I grew up hearing in church as a child. I didn't even think that intercessory prayer somehow, this idea you could coerce or beg or cajole God into doing something to change the events in history and life, I didn't buy that. And the idea particularly that somehow Christians were superior to other religious traditions in the world, like fingernails on blackboards for me, because I knew some other people who were not practicing Christians, and they were great folks. So, I don't hold a theistic view. I learned in seminary there are several models. Theism, as I understand it, means that there's the universe, the world, the universe, and if you can take the world and universe away, and God still exists, because God created it all. Then there's this other kind of pantheistic view. Well, no, it's all wrapped together. God is a part of this. So if you take, the universe away, you're in essence taking God away, because God's in everything. He's in nature, so to speak. And then there's another more subtle thing that's kind of a both and. And by the time I graduated from seminary, I was in that both and camp. But I think I've maintained and held this notion. I don't particularly want to argue with anybody. I simply don't know if there is a transcendent reality that somehow brought it all into being. That makes sense. I have a hard time even with science telling that the universe was created out of some gases and molecules and all that coming together. I just have a hard time understanding how all that happened. It seems like just a lot of randomness. So, while I still have to create some room in my own belief system for those kind of actualities, the reason I'm still a Christian and call myself a Christian is because I think my life orientation, who I understand myself to be and what I understand about others in the world, it's been inspired by the Jesus story. And in the Jesus story, at least the part that I've heard, it's about the self-giving power of love and forgiveness. I believe in that power of self-giving love and forgiveness. I've seen it, I've experienced it, and I believe it's at work. Now, I'm not going to quibble whether somehow that self-giving power exists in all times outside the universe. I don't know. But I find myself living within kind of an existential experience of knowing that exists. So when someone says to me, do you believe in God? I have to go back to one little verse in the New Testament. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Now, all the other stuff, I don't have much room for. So I think the other question that we were going to ask each other was, what led you to be a self-affirming atheist?
Well, as I said, I'm not sure anything led me in the direction of atheism. It was the absence of belief in the traditional doctrines that led me to not be a theist. But I want to emphasize that I don't disagree with much that Lou said. In fact, I have a chapter in the book that's you have a handout for, titled Jesus, Prophet of Peace and Love, or Purveyor of Fear and Hate. It's a question. I'll phrase it again. Was Jesus a prophet of peace and love, or was he a purveyor of fear and hate? Most people don't know the answer because they don't understand the logical use of the word or, and they haven't read the gospel. And that includes most Christians. Almost no, or very few Christians have actually studied the Bible. If they did, they would not consider it to be God's perfect word. It's a terrible book. You ought to read it. That's the reason I wrote the book, which was published just a year ago, over about 20 years since I've been in Texas. I retired in 2002 from the University of Arkansas to dedicate myself to two tasks. One, I raised African leopard tortoises. Do any of you have an interest in Chelonian herpetology? African leopard tortoises. I raised about 500 over a period of 7 or 8 years. I had to finish my academic work, but then I spent a lot of time reading the Bible from cover to cover, studying related texts, and thinking about what the value of this material was. For the most part, I consider it to be a terrible book, as I said, and Lou, to some extent, agrees with me. For example, here's an ethical rule that you hear all the time, especially here in Texas: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and a life for a life. We're going to talk briefly about moral values in just a minute, but that's an example of an immoral principle. I absolutely oppose the death penalty. Capital punishment is a scourge, and of course, it's a major issue here. Didn't we execute somebody just a week ago? The Bible's a terrible book, and I've documented that. I'm going to go ahead and tell you the answer to the question I posed. Was Jesus a prophet of peace and love, or a purveyor of fear and hate? In fact, he was both. Roughly half and half. He was a prophet of peace and love. There's no doubt about that, and I endorse those ethical teachings. But he was also absolutely obsessed with hell. He talked more about hell than any other single character in the Bible, and he talked more about hell than everybody else in the Bible. He said that the vast majority of humankind would go to hell, and that meant everlasting suffering. And he described hell in great detail. I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that's ethical and loving behavior. It contradicts the idea of Jesus, the loving Savior. But where there's good material, I endorse it. Give credit for what's positive. But when there's bad material, evil material, I condemn it. We might talk for just a few minutes a little later about the Texas Republican Party platform. I don't know if many of you are Republicans or Christians. It's an embarrassment to the Republican Party, and in my opinion, it's a slander on Christianity.
Well, I want to pick up on the point that Brian made, because I don't disagree with him, that the Bible is filled with a lot of things that seem to contradict that very basic principle I mentioned earlier, that I think is the core of the whole Christian message, which is about self-giving love and forgiveness. But what saved me and helped me stay within the Christian community for 40 years, what I learned in seminary, that the Bible is not self-interpreting. In fact, the Jesus story was created by the early church. Jesus didn't write anything down. We don't have anything recorded other than what someone thought or remembered that Jesus had said. And the biblical scholar Rudolf Bolton said way back before the turn of the 20th century that the best he could tell, there was only 17 or 18 actual verses in the whole New Testament and all those gospel stories that he could really say might have been said by Jesus. And that was this critical study of the Bible. Well, I was exposed to critical biblical study. I don't think that in most liberal seminaries to this day that any graduate would come out of there who've approached the critical biblical studies and saying it's all of the words in the Bible are divinely inspired. All of the words in the Bible are to be lived by or to be understood. As Brian said, there's a lot of horrendous stuff. I found myself, in a crossfire with the Presbyterian Church as a denomination in the late 1990s over the issue of homosexuality. And what I realized was, conservative Christians had picked out, I think there are about 8 verses that kind of condemn homosexuality in all of the Bible, most in the Old Testament. And there was a lot of biblical research and study about those particular 8 verses, and what they concluded by studying those 8 verses was they were taken out of context. But whether they were or not, I think that those who wrote the Bible were living with the understanding of the age that they lived in. And they were limited by that. So it's been a task for most of us who still hang on to the Bible is to peel back all those layers. And it's like peeling an onion. I peel so much of it, I probably wouldn't disagree with you on, all of that stuff that probably should be peeled and thrown in the garbage, or compost bin would be better. But the core, and my way of saying is I try to interpret the Bible through a lens. Is it love fulfilling, and is it kingdom producing, meaning a kingdom of peace? That's the litmus test. If it doesn't fit those two principles, then I'm quite willing to say, and in fact, I think the Bible in fundamentalist Christian hands and Christian, is, as Brian says, it's just downright dangerous. They use it as a club. And what I reject is that when any Christian says, my way is the true only way, that drives me crazy. I would never say that my way is the only true way. I'm saying this out of my own experience, but I'm not trying to say this should be everybody else's experience. I think the other question, Brian, that might be helpful to people to hear, given what we would call plurality of religious identities in the U.S., are there variations within the atheist community?
Yes, there are. There are considerable variations. One, there are the militant atheists, and there are the people who attack fundamentalist Christians and almost everybody else. There are libertarian atheists, and they're the ones who say, everybody for himself. That's the law of life as far as the libertarian atheists are concerned. The largest single group that falls in the unbelieving category consists of people who identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. In other words, they reject the dogma, but they still feel there is some transcendent power. I see no evidence of transcendence or gods of any kind, and I can cite a bushel full of evidence just as Lou can on the other side, but I would refer to one topic that I took a special interest in starting about 40 years ago, and that's the question, does God answer prayer? That's the critical issue in all religion, because people who believe in God or the gods want to communicate. They want some kind of response. They want some kind of emotional support, some answer, some help, especially when they're having difficulty, as was just mentioned, when people have serious diseases like cancer and heart disease and so forth. There's a natural inclination to look for help. And of course, religious people and many non-religious people in times of crisis will look to a God. There have been 5 replicated clinical trials of intercessory prayer reported in the medical literature since 1989. The final 2 studies were in 2005 and 2006. They provide definitive evidence in the opinion of Christians who conducted these studies that God did not respond to intercessory prayer. The subjects in these studies were all heart patients in cardiac units in 5 different medical centers around the country. What better opportunity did God ever have to demonstrate his power? And remember, Lou, God said, put me to the test. I'll demonstrate my power. He did not. Many people, of course, have now rejected the studies and said that you can't put God to the test. There is no scientific methodology that God would participate in and so forth. Just a series of excuses. But they're all wrong because the evidence is overwhelming. Evidence-based medicine has been the greatest contribution in the practice of medicine since about 1985. That methodology can be applied outside of medicine, and it is, and prayer was a perfect example, even though these studies were conducted in medical centers. I have an entire section in my book summarizing these studies and the evidence. There are many other sources of evidence. The ubiquitous presence of evil. Lou and I agree it's almost impossible to explain evil when you believe in God. I'm going to let Lou respond to that one.
Well, go back to the intercessory prayer. I think I said earlier, I don't have a notion that somehow that humans pray to a being that somehow will be motivated to do something on our behalf. I haven't had a belief in that since I was probably 12 years old. I do remember praying that my grandmother wouldn't die because I was close to her when I was 12. But since that time, I've never had that. However, since I had to have triple bypass surgery about 7 years ago, I had a lot of people saying to me, Lou, we'll be praying for you. And I was very appreciative for those prayers. I did not take that to mean that somehow they were evoking God to protect me from the surgeon being drunk that day when he was operating on me, or that somehow there would be a germ that would kind of get into me and kill me after surgery. They were just expressing, I think, their care and concern and love. I see the value of prayer as creating basically what I'd call empathy for one another. I don't see it. So when you use the term he, I even reject the idea that God has this idea of a God that has some kind of human form, that we anthropomorphize God, that God has a gender identity, or God has a particular kind of personality. The Bible, of course, talks about that. These old stories about God being mad and angry about this and saying, I'm going to wipe them all out, sends Jonah there to Nineveh, a huge city, of all a bunch of heathens, and he's going to go, supposed to preach, you got to believe in God or you're going to be destroyed. It's an ironic story because he doesn't want to do this, but he goes into this great city, according to the story, and he says, God's going to destroy you in 40 days unless you repent. And the funny part of the story is they all repent. The king repents. All the people repent. They put sackcloth and ashes on all the animals. They want the animals to repent too. It's a funny story. It wasn't intended. Now, Christians get hung up, a lot of them, biblical literalists get hung up on the whale or the big fish swallowing Jonah, and somehow he survived. But the prayer, Jonah offered a prayer. He didn't want to go to Nineveh. He resisted. So, according to the writer of the story, the storm came up for the sailors to throw him off the boat. Now Jonah's in the belly of the great fish, and he has a prayer. He kind of comes to his senses kind of prayer. I've prayed some of those kind of prayers myself. But the funny part of the story is it makes the whale sick, and he throws Jonah up on the beach. Now, there's no reason to take that story literally. You have to kind of say, what's the writer trying to say here? And what the writer was trying to say is this shocking message that the people of Israel at that time did not want to hear, which is if you really want to believe in a God of love, you've got to be open that God's going to love people that you detest. that you would rather have killed than include them within the circle of faith. But that's my take on prayer.
I think we disagree a little bit on that. What I'm going to do now is make a positive statement about religion and faith, and then we can probably move to questions and answers. I have great respect for people of faith, and I know that faith is important in the lives of many people. The best statement I read was about 12 years ago. It was in Parade magazine, of all places, the Sunday supplement. It was a one-page, 200-word statement by Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Britain. He explained that faith was important in guiding his career in politics. He made no attempt to justify or argue for. He just made a convincing case that faith to him was important. I think that's true for Lou. I think it's true for many people here and many people in the community. So whenever religious people do good, I give them credit. And if it's the faith that motivates them, I give credit to their faith.
Real quickly, one of the concerns that I've often heard about atheists, if without God you can't have morality. What do you think is the basis of morality?
I think we learn morality. I think it's part of the culture. And I think we learn in our families, from our parents, from their examples. I grew up in a large family. My mother had 10 kids. 8 of us survived. All have been successful at one thing and another. And I give credit completely to my parents and also teachers in the schools, the role models. I think that's where our ethical and moral values come from. I reject the idea, of course, of a transcendent morality. But we're good because we learn to be good, and we're also bad, some of us, because we learn to be bad, because sometimes our culture reinforces bad behavior.
Now, that's probably a place where we don't agree. I believe there is kind of a sense of transcendence in morality. I understand perfectly morality changes over time. It's evolutionary to some degree. But it seems to my reading of human history that there's been always, whether you go back to the Code of Hammurabi or you get to the Ten Commandments or you march all the way through time and cultures and places, it seems to me that a lot of the great religions of the world have always intuited in some way some basic sense of morality, of not doing harm to others, not taking things that aren't yours from others, trying to protect the vulnerable. All of those kinds of things have been part of kind of, it seems to me, almost a transhistorical basis of morality. And the explanations I hear from those who want to posit that morality comes from memes or something that's evolved over generations of humanity, whether from the cavemen into the 3rd century BC. I don't want to quibble about any of that. I want to say, well, what they would call morality memes, I would say it was religion. Religion intuited those things. So, do you want to respond to that?
I think we may disagree on some elements of that issue, but we would have to have a further discussion before I could say for sure.
Fair enough. Okay, questions. Anybody got a question that you want to pose for Brian to answer? Yes.
Astronomy makes me uncomfortable. One of the hard things about it is it makes me see them so insignificant. The universe is so vast and it's getting bigger and bigger. I'm just asking, how do you cope with this vast universe and where it came from and why it's there?
Was that for Brian?
The vastness of the universe is truly amazing. In fact, the December issue of the Scientific American includes some photos from the James Webb Space Telescope. When you look at those pictures and you realize what's involved, hundreds of billions of years or light years in this case, it is overwhelming. So my response is, I've only got a few more years and I'm not going to worry about the vastness of it.
I read somewhere, more recently, it's 5 years ago, in the New Yorker magazine, I think it was, a guy was reporting on the letters from Albert Einstein that had been discovered, where he was writing and talking to a Lutheran pastor about faith in God and belief in God. And Einstein pretty much talked about his not believing in this supernatural power at all. But at the end, he said something like, the writer of this said, if you read carefully in his letter, he had what he called a night sky theology, that Einstein looked out in the vastness of the universe and knew enough to know kind of the shape of the universe, said, something had to start that thing. It didn't start out of nothingness. And so I think I'm open to that. I also like William James said, about the human mind's capability of knowing all of these things about ultimate reality. James said, we may be just like dogs and cats wandering into a great library. All the books are there, but they don't have a clue what's in them. Other questions?
Thanks, Woody. All right, I have a bunch of questions, but I don't want to waste everyone's time here. So I'll ask like the most general one. I'm a very logical person, and when I was younger and I was kind of wrestling with theology and, does this really make sense? And, Jonah and the whale and stories like that, and people were taking them literally, especially in Oklahoma where I was at it for a time. And my question is, logically, I had to come up with my own religion. My own religion right now, to my mind, it's completely logical, but it also has a spiritual element to it. And my question is, from a purely logical standpoint, given the recent emergence, recent popularity of these large-scale simulations and this creation of these literal other worlds that people can kind of go into as the soul of a player, and there are godlike creatures that made the simulation, and giving what we, the expansion of that, realm of our society and that knowledge base, is it more logical to assume a question of existence, a question of God's existence or not? Isn't a more logical answer, I don't know, rather than they do not exist?
I think the reasonable answer is, I don't know. I don't know for sure, because there could be a transcendent power. But I've reached the conclusion in my own mind that I'm not going to worry about that anymore. In fact, I reached that conclusion a long time ago. So I am more concerned about the ethical issues right here on earth, right here in this country and community, like women's rights, abortion rights, the question of the death penalty, which we just mentioned, and many of the other very important, and for some the gay rights movement, for example, the transgender kids. I think I'm more concerned about those matters than I am about resolving in my own mind what's going to happen to me when I die. It doesn't affect me at all, and consequently I have no interest in even reflecting on the existence of God or heaven or hell or anything else.
We agree totally on this thing, I think. My take is very similar. My faith in the inspiration from the Jesus story about the power of self-giving love and forgiveness is an ethical issue for me. It doesn't depend on ever having this issue about is there a reality, a transcendent reality, proved or disproved. I have a more of an existential, everyday approach to that issue. I don't particularly believe there's an afterlife. So all that whole part about in the Christian story about going to heaven or going to hell, but my litmus test again is something Brian said earlier. If it's not rooted in love, if it's based in fear, I go running when I hear fear stuff. Because I think, perfect love casts out fear. And so if it's got too much fear in it, and I'm with you about, I think capital punishment is what I call state-sanctioned revenge.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. I know we have a short amount of time, but this is simple. This first question is to you, Brian. Do you have children? Do you have children?
No.
Okay, thank you. I know your answer, sir. This is to both of you, and these are easy. How do you, both of you, but I think I know your answer, sir. Brian, how do you offer comfort to people if they come to you and someone is ill? How do you, in your words, it doesn't have to be lengthy, how do you offer comfort, number one? Number two, for both of you, what do you think about the practice of meditation, whatever form it takes? Thank you.
That's an important question because the issue comes up all the time. My neighbor died just a couple of months ago of pancreatic cancer. She lived with that terrible disease for over a year, and occasionally in the early stages I would go visit with her. I behaved toward her the same way I had for the previous 15 years, just as a friend. I could not offer comfort beyond that. In fact, I knew there was no way to offer comfort because she was almost certainly going to die, and she knew it, and Bob knew it. Everyone knows that there are terminal diseases, and the best thing you can do is be supportive and be a good friend. I worked with hospice patients for 9 years when I was in Arkansas. And just visiting and being friendly and offering a little bit of humor can be very helpful. I still think humor is an important tonic or therapeutic, and it reminds me of an interesting remark by Chris Christie, the politician. Do you know who Chris Christie is? Former. Anyway, what he said about the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, who just won re-election and then was campaigning for Herschel Walker. He said that Brian Kemp wants to become the first human to drag Herschel Walker across the goal line.
I want to address the meditation issue, because I think meditation gets at a key piece of what I hope religion at its best will do, which has helped us to deal with what I'd call existential anxieties that we all have, that life throws at us. And meditation, from my perspective, is a way of trying to recognize life is a gift, and it's fragile, very fragile. And we have to find ways to, at times, calm our spirits, overcome some anxieties that get us out of control. And I think meditation does that, yoga does that. There's a lot of things that we can do to do that. So that mindfulness is a mindfulness of we're just a speck in a bigger thing is really important.
Thank you for your answers.
We're going to take like two more. I'm sorry. We got
Two more.
okay.
Well, first, I want to thank both of you. I've found your discussion extremely thoughtful and interesting and illuminating. So I'm very grateful to both of you. I have two questions. One I hope can be answered briefly, and that is, how do each of you define transcendence? What do you mean by that? And second, Joe's comment earlier about the cosmos, and doesn't it suggest there is something out there? And Lou said something sympathetic to that. My response to that would be to think that there is something out there, to make an assertion that there is something out there, is an argument from ignorance. We're going from what we do not know to making a claim based on our ignorance. So thank you.
Well, Keith, I think I heard in the question also an answer. So let me just address the question part I heard. Where do I sense that there is some transcendent reality or anything beyond what we know? Well, that's back to the question I think John was asking about the reality of God. I don't know. All I can say is intuitively, I may say I hope there is. Intuitively, I think other experiences of humanity have suggested that there may be. I just happen to choose to want to believe there is something. I'm just choosing that. That's a faith statement. I cannot demonstrate that. There's no rational support for that, as you point out. But call it a hope, call it an intuitive instinct, call it trusting humanity's reading about this from the beginning of religion. I just happen to say that's the hope I have. I can't argue for it at all in any way that it makes logical sense. I wouldn't even try.
I think Thomas Huxley probably said it best when he addressed the matter of belief and unbelief when he was defending Charles Darwin. He defined the rational position as agnosticism, the absence of knowledge. Sometimes that is just what we have to say. I think that's what Lou was saying, and that's certainly what I'm saying with regard to many questions. We just don't know, and we're probably never going to know.
You want to take one more, Lou? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been very enlightening, rewarding. But early on, you talked about how you made up your minds that the direction you wanted to take and how you questioned a lot of religion. And I gained a lot of my thinking from my parents and the people I was around, and wasn't as objective then as I may be now. And I just wondered if you had some people guiding you in the direction you took, or how you came about that.
Thank you, Jim. I guess that's directed at me, yes, absolutely. As I said, I rejected all of that Christian fundamentalist when I was 12 years of age. I just dropped out. And then in college, there was this cute gal that I wanted to date. And she lived in an apartment next door to where office supply place where I was a delivery guy. And I was trying to find a way to meet her. And I ran into her in a little neighborhood grocery store at the dairy counter. She was getting some milk. I was looking at his ice cream sandwich. And here's my opportunity. Now, I didn't say God created this opportunity. It was just circumstance. And I was excited. And I asked her for a date. And she said, well, yes, but I told her that on a Friday evening was what I would ask her. And she said, I'm sorry, I can't do it Friday. I do it Saturday maybe or some other time next week. But I'm involved in this ministry with the Little Presbyterian Church down on 6th and Silver in downtown Jacksonville, Florida. Now, if you want to come, you can go with me, and when we go out afterwards, I almost said, no, thank you. A Christian ministry, that was kind of like, I'm not interested in being with my ideas of Christians at that time were they were either fundamentalists or they were atheists. I didn't have much appreciation for the plurality, because I was raised in this little Southern Baptist culture, and that's everybody I knew was Southern Baptist. But somehow, the other problem was I knew enough about downtown Jacksonville, Florida at that time in the 60s. Race riots were going on, and 6th and Silver was a dangerous place for a white guy to be. And so I had another pause before I said, yeah, I'll go with you. But however, sex and love does strange things to the heart. And I caved in, and I said, okay, I'll go with you. I'll meet you down there. And I found a young Presbyterian minister in the inner city trying to keep white and black kids from killing one another. And I got intrigued with this guy. And it was clear in terms of what he was trying to do. He's trying to love them. He was doing what this first principle in this Unitarian list of principles, he was saying, all of you have inherent worth and dignity. And I was blown away with that. And I started asking him questions. I knew he was a minister, and I started asking him, and he looked at me and he said, are you a Southern Baptist? I said, he's clairvoyant. How did he know that? Well, he saw through that. I mean, he had a whole different orientation to Christianity. So it was through my exposure. By the way, I married that gal, But it was through that exposure to that Presbyterian minister, I began to realize there are different forms of Christianity. And he was instrumental in encouraging me to go to seminary. I went to seminary. I had no interest. I'd gone to graduate school in religion. I'd written a paper on Henry Nelson Wyman, who's a philosopher religion guy who talks about, the creative interchange and where the good comes from. He was a student of Dewey. And so I went to seminary just more of an intellectual pursuit, maybe a spiritual pursuit. And I had no intention of being a minister. But when you went through your second year, you had to go through what they call a faculty midler conference, and that meant the faculty, 2 faculty members, 2 peer groups, and 2 of your field ed ministers you worked under came together, and you wrote papers and you gave them to them, and they would decide whether you would finish in the seminary track to be ordained minister, or they'd wash you out and say, you get here's another master's of religion degree, go do something else. And they all pushed on me to go into church work. And I just kept thinking, I am not cut out for this. And finally, my wife, this same gal, said, I think you can do it. So I took my first church, a little church in Virginia, only because they describe God as creative interchange. And I didn't think I'd ever find a church that was anywhere aligned with where I was coming from at that point. So I took that call and I said, I'll do it for 3 years and then I'll go do something else. And 40 years later, when I retired from the Presbyterian Church in Austin, I've always had to find these very liberal, far-left churches. But I've been very, very grateful for Charlie Scott, and I was just sending him a Christmas card the other day, for him saying, to all those other kids, which included me, you have inherent worth and dignity. He would say, you're a product of God's love. And I accept that. But I've had a bunch of people like that all along in my life who kept encouraging and supporting. Out of that, what I call that spirit, power, transcendent sense about self-giving love and forgiveness. And I've been responding to that ever since.
Lou illustrates the outstanding feature of good preachers. He's a storyteller. Atheists tend not to be very good storytellers because we stick to the facts. So there isn't much I can say along the same line, but what I do want to say is that I've enjoyed being here, visiting with you. It's been a great experience. It takes me back more than 20 years to my previous interactions with Unitarians. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
We thank you, Brian. We're going to end today with the most appropriate hymn I could find in the hymn book. It's number 313. The words will be projected, and the title of it is, What a Piece of Work We Are. Yeah, the chalice. Yeah, or do you want to do it? Would you let him know? I want to talk to him. Thank you, Gene. I don't have a mic up here. Oh, I do? All right. Thank you. Wow.
I don't know about you, but my level of incomprehension just went up a couple of notches here. This is what I signed up for. Okay, as we end our service today, we extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. As we go from here, let us carry the light of love, the commitment of peace, and a mutual regard for one another in our hearts until we are together again. We invite you to join us for coffee and fellowship. Thank you.